This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Well, today, thank you for your patience, and we're going to try to cover an awful lot today since we spent 7 weeks on Genesis to basically the post-exilic prophets of the Jewish scriptures, or the Old Testament, if you prefer. And today we're spending just one session on New Testament. Isn't that terrible? It's unfair, I agree, but we'll give it a good go. We'll only be here till 5 o'clock, as no, we'll try to make it work. And today is going to be filled, as I was mentioning to a few of you coming in, some of you with very keen sight, or hope to change the world's sight to better. I know ophthalmologists will get that pun. But today we'll delve a bit into what could be considered heresy. But I'm not going to say it's all relative because it isn't. But what is heresy? It really depends, doesn't it? To the Baptists, heresy is very different than to the Roman Catholics, and so on. But one man's meat, another man's poison. And sadly, the schismatic effect of religion, the two things we're not supposed to talk about that we always do, religion and politics. And of course today, how can we not talk about politics, right? Today, though, you'll see what I mean when I say that it depends on your definition of heresy, which is, as you also know, is a Greek word. When you compare orthodoxy and heterodoxy and heresia, it's basically meaning heresy, deviation from orthodoxy. And orthos, as you know, in Greek, has to do with straightness, rightness, straightness. Doxy having to do with doctrine and dogma. But if you're Jewish, of course, the New Testament is heresy, right? And if you're Protestant, much of what seems to be thou doth protest too much about may seem like heresy. So it's really a conundrum. The only thing is, people certainly shouldn't shed blood or ostracize or in any way persecute for it. So please don't throw things at me today. That was supposed to get a laugh, and I didn't get anything. All right. So let's jump in, shall we? Now, very little to do with today with essentially the Gospels, the Evangelia. I'm going to repeat a little bit of what I said, and I ended last week with a tease, with a hook, where I said that a lot of the things that Jesus is quoted as has said both in the Gospels and inferred in the epistles, which are often like Hebrew, Talmudic, Mishnaic, Gemaric commentaries on the Gospels, particularly since so many of the writers were Jews, heretical or not, depending on your definition. Then if you look closely, since the New Testament is written in Koine Greek, the popular Greek of the Hellenistic era, it doesn't always register that when what Jesus actually probably said was most likely in Aramaic or Aramaized Hebrew, because that was his native tongue. Now, Jesus certainly knew enough Greek to make comments about it. And let me just give you some evidence thereof. Evidently, there were quite a few theaters in Galilee. The closest one is technically, that I know of well, the closest to Caesarea, which isn't close to Galilee really at all. And the other theater would be in Beit Shan, or Scythopolis, part of the Decapolis, that Hellenized remnant of Alexander's and the Seleucids' sojourn in the Levant. Now, how do we know Jesus was aware of Greek drama, whether or not he ever attended them or not? He uses a word that doesn't exist in Aramaic or Hebrew whatsoever. It's a word for actor. For actor. When actors are in the theater, they stand under judgment. And all Greek dramas are performed, at least in antiquity, in trilogies. When you look at Aeschylus and Sophocles and so on, and even the comedies of Aristophanes, they're performed in trilogies. And Greek drama, particularly tragedy, tragoidia, which means goat song, because a goat is sacrificed to the god Dionysus in the altar, the thymel in front of the orchestra. The goat cries out a death rattle. It's horrible to hear. It brings a shudder to sacrifice that goat to Dionysus. But what the god hears is not a death cry. The god hears a song. Isn't that interesting? Goat song. Tragus, goat. Ode, oidia. Tragoidia. It's a goat song. And this was a form not of entertainment, but of mediation. Greek drama, particularly tragedy, was not entertainment whatsoever. It was an attempt to mediate between the gods and humans. And Dionysus was half human. His mother is Semele, princess of Thebes. And as a mediatorial god, he would be brought, his statue would be brought before the theater, and the judges in the plays, just to emphasize, if you look at every single great Greek theater, and I can't think of any that are exceptions to this, every great Greek theater has a temple to Dionysus adjacent to it, because it's not entertainment. It's religious. It's philosophical. It's an attempt to answer huge questions, heavy, burdensome questions like what is destiny? What is free will? And so on. What is a hero? What does it mean to be human? And as Sappho said, if mortality were a good thing, the gods would have it too. This idea of what is mortality. So Greek drama was religious, philosophical, and every single judge who always sat in the front row of the theaters were priests. Sometimes priestesses, but normally not. Priests were the judges. And so Jesus certainly must have known enough Greek to know this word, under. Think of the Greek word for under. Think of a needle under the skin. What is that called? Hypodermic. Hypo means under. Judgment is krites. Put the two together, the actors are hypokrites. They're under judgment. Jesus uses this word, hypocrite. It's not a Hebrew or Aramaic word. And I could cite other examples of words Jesus used that shows, these words show or show that he literally knew enough Greek. It was the lingua franca as well of the East. So a lot of Greeks had to learn, a lot of Greeks, of course, had to learn Aramaic and to live in the land, but most Jews who were urban also had to have a smattering of Greek. And particularly because the Septuagint had already been translated into Greek under the Ptolemies, so many of the Sadducees, Hellenistic Jews, who were also scribes and legal advisors, knew Greek. So Jesus was in an environment where Greek was spoken. I hope that's clear. If not, you can do a search. Did Jesus understand Greek? Now, even though Jesus is speaking some Greek, many of the things that he says, as I suggested, are word plays or make sense, better sense, in Aramaic than in Greek. So when we read the New Testament, remember, we're reading often an English translation, if it's of the Roman Catholic versions, Douay Arens, it's often mostly from the Vulgate, which, remember, is baby Latin. So you have English going back to baby Latin. So you have so many filters in the way. The baby Latin's probably not the best source. That's why Erasmus was so happy in Rotterdam to get the Jewish scriptures coming from the Jews who were kicked out of Spain from Ferdinand and Isabella, who went to Lisbon, to Portugal, then to Amsterdam. And that's why also when Constantinople fell, the Greeks who left there in 1453 brought a lot of the Greek biblical scholarship to the West, particularly Lorenzo de' Medici and the Laurentian Library in Florence. So suddenly you have this new infusion of both Hebrew and Greek biblical studies coming to Renaissance Europe. And it made a big difference. Some say it, in some sense, helped to foment the Reformation because of new emphasis, as Martin Luther said, sola scriptura, on the scripture, particularly the new scholarship that came out from the scripture. All right, now as I said, it's going to sound a little heretical, so bear with me. You don't have to buy into what I'm saying. But there's a great book by Alistair McGrath called In the Beginning, if you want to read about biblical scholarship of the Renaissance and Reformation coming from a very great Oxford scholar. He asked me to speak for him at Oxford once, and I have great admiration and respect for Alistair McGrath, A-L-I-S-T-E-R, capital M, small c, G-R-A-T-H. You can check that out. Now, let's jump into here again. I've already shown you this, but what is for emphasis today? This valley, remember the sons of Hinnom, Ben Hinnom. Remember what it becomes? In Jerusalem, for Jesus' day, it becomes the trash dump. Why? Because it was forever completely a desecrated place. It was a place that was despicable because of human sacrifice there. And that was anathema to the Jews, certainly to anyone of a moral stance, of tone. So down here, the trash dump, where literally you could say it burned forever. And that, remember, we talked about this, became the source of the word Gehinnom in Hebrew. Gehenna, remember, Gar, those of you who speak Hebrew, Gar is the word for valley in Hebrew. So the valley, Gar ben Hinnom. But when you attach Gar to Hinnom, it shortens, like so many words. Polarized becomes polarization. You shorten vowels, you drop things. It's verbal economy. So that word becomes Ge, valley of Enna, Gehenna, because the H, it doesn't come off as a rough breath mark when it comes from Aramaized Hebrew into Greek. So Gehenna. So here we have this idea of Gehenna. It is not an idea that is found in the Hebrew Scriptures. Hell, if you wish, is the way it's translated. It is not a Hebrew term. It is an Aramaized term that comes into Greek. So, you could talk about doctrine of hell, but I'd rather not, wouldn't you? I read yesterday, what was it? Trump says he doesn't hope he has to ask for too much forgiveness. Did you read that? Anyway. Now, speaking of Gehenna, of course, this is where we get Dante's Inferno, isn't it? From those ideas. Now, naturally, Dante put all his enemies in there. So you can see even popes or anti-popes end up in those smoking pits. And since I already mentioned him, did you see this in The Economist early last year? This was the holiday version, right? You might recognize a few world-famous faces in there. A Rough Guide to Hell. Isn't it, well, maybe not amusing. Maybe this will be more amusing, though. Speaking of, there we go. Did you see this in the New Yorker? Okay. I'm going to step on a lot of toes today. I might as well, right? Religion and politics. Did you see this? Yeah, well, now you have. Just look it up in the New Yorker. Don't you love New Yorker cartoons? All right, there we go. That's quite a development there, isn't it? Yes. Well, all right. Now, heresy. There are a lot of heresies. I don't think we should apply this to Mary Magdalene, heresy, because technically heresy only applies to usually deities. And I don't think we want to deify Mary Magdalene, whoever she was. But you've read this book, I hope. I'm not sure, I don't say that you've read that book, but you've read that book, yes? I remember I was giving a lecture at the Louvre, and the great gallery in the Louvre on Caravaggio, because there's a row of Caravaggios there. And it's a huge chamber, as you know, arcaded, very high ceilings, arched, beautiful gallery, almost as high as this room and 10 times longer. And all of a sudden, we heard a herd of people running up the gallery, and they were frantic. And you could hear their sneakers even flip-flopping, against the floor. And they came up all worried and breathless to me because they heard American English. And they were clutching a book that I didn't see at first. All of them. And they said, "Where is it? Where is it? Where is it?" And I said, "Where is what?" And then I realized what they were looking for. Where's the Mona Lisa? Because in Dan Brown, it's in the Great Gallery. But it's not in the Great Gallery. Never has been. And so I said to them, "You actually think that book is true?" Anyway, so Mary Magdalene. The source book, of course, is this book, which I'm sure you may have read. It's very sensationalist, and this takes it, ramps it up 10 notches, doesn't it? The sensationalism about Mary Magdalene. The physicality of a relationship between Mary and Jesus. Well, this may not be heresy about Mary, but it does get heretical about Jesus, doesn't it? Right? If, of course, by that you define heresy as involving deity. Have you read this book? Yes. It's amazing. It's astonishing. It's brilliant. And it's loaded with heresy, if you wish. But there is a sense in which temptation, which in the biblical scholarship, temptation is not sin at all. Everyone is tempted. It's yielding to it that becomes the problem, right? So Mary Magdalene becomes a necessary crux because in Christian theology, Jesus has to be tempted to the utmost. And in Christian theology, Jesus doesn't sin. Tempted to the ultimate, but not caving in thereto. And so Mary Magdalene provides that necessary crux. A woman of incredible beauty and sensuality who does something, if you take all the scriptures, all the gospels, and conflate them together to create a Mary Magdalene, then an event described in scripture could be sort of this ultimate temptation. I'm going to go into that a little bit. Now, who was Mary Magdalene? Well, these are the gospel texts that purport to be about her. Since you can have this on the online version anyway, I don't have to go into too much detail. You can read these. But these are her roles. She becomes the literal paragon of the transformation of a sinner into a saint. The Vulgate calls her peccatrix. An IX word ending is feminine, so she is the female sinner non parile. Sancta, but she's this transformative person from sinner to saint. Now you could say, well, if you really look closely in the New Testament, the greatest sinners always were the greatest saints. Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, and Augustine, right? Wallowing in the flesh pots of Carthage. You're very quiet today. You're not laughing at my jokes. That's okay. As I said, this is serious stuff, so I can understand. I'm not trying to make too much light of it. But for the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent in the last quarter of the 16th century, she becomes the very icon for the Baroque era of penitence. And she becomes the patron saint of Reformed prostitutes. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, but it's a necessary transformation. And then, as I said, she becomes the crux of Jesus' temptation. If you read the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 4, and so on, where Christ had to be tempted like us, but to the ultimate. So enough said about that theology. Part of some of this I gave at Venice, at the University in Venice, Ca' Foscari in Venice, and I also gave some of this at Alexander von Humboldt University in Berlin last year. Not to a Christian or religious audience, however. Now, here is an interesting story. I shared this last semester in the Bible Uncensored. Notice Jesus appeared, and so on, temples of the law and the Pharisees, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, brought in a woman caught in adultery, in flagrante delicto. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" Isn't it ironic that the man isn't brought in, only the woman, right? Well, it's a very chauvinist society, and however the entrapment went, or whatever, we don't know, but they only brought in the woman, caught literally in the act. So literally they had to kind of be voyeurs, didn't they, to be in this process. Now, they're absolutely right that in the law of Moses, this adulterous act is required to have a very severe penalty, stoning. But when they say, "Now what do you say?" It says they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Because on the one hand, if he says, "Yes, I agree with Moses' law, stone her," then they're going to say, "Okay, great, you agree with Moses, but you've been preaching this gospel of grace. You're contradicting yourself." But if you say, "Don't stone her," and instead forgive her, give grace, then you're contravening the law of Moses, so you're a heretic. So they thought they had him, either way, over a barrel. Says, but Jesus bent down and started writing on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "All right, let any one of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." So essentially, instead of taking the heat, having to make a decision, which is going to be a polarized decision either way, he turns the attention back to them and says, "Okay, fine. This is what Moses says. Go ahead. You sinless one, throw the first stone." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard it began to go away one at a time, the elders first, until only Jesus was left, the woman still standing there. All right. So be it. You know, probably, by the way, the Greek says, it doesn't say go and sin no more. It says go and leave your life of sin. That's the better translation. But there's not condemnation here. And it's interesting. Here is Peter Bruegel's wonderful grisaille painting of this, where Jesus is sort of avoiding the altercation for a moment and notice the people beginning to walk away and the mystery of what he said. I used to see this all the time at the Courtauld Institute in London. As I said a few weeks ago, I could eat my lunch sitting before these incredible paintings. Just bring a brown paper bag lunch and eat art and food at the same time. But it's an amazing picture, isn't it? And this is one of the internal gospel documents that said, even though she's not named, it's said to be generally Mary Magdalene. Now, she's not named, so that's a stretch. That's a conflated idea. However, here she is named in Luke 8. After this, Jesus traveled about, so on, so on, so on. Also some women who'd been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now, interesting, even in the oldest texts, that insertion called Magdalene is apparently there. And Magdala is a little village on the west shore of the Sea of Galilee, just north of Tiberias, and it was famous for its courtesans. Very wealthy courtesans had villas there, and so on. So this says Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Now, here is the most famous story. And again, this doesn't mention, in the Gospel of Luke, it doesn't mention Mary as Magdalene. And in some of the other synoptic Gospels, it does mention that it's Mary Magdalene. One of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. He fed at the Pharisee's house, reclined at the table, a woman in the town who lived a sinful life. A woman who was a sinner. The Vulgate in Latin says peccatrix. The Greek says hamartola. Hamartia is sin in Greek. Hamartola is a sinful woman. Okay? So she, a sinful life, learned that Jesus was eating. So she came with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now, the problem with this is primarily a linguistic issue. The text doesn't really say alabaster jar. It says an alabastron. That's a type of vessel. It's a perfume vessel. It's not the alabaster that's precious. It's the perfume that's precious. And in fact, the word, what happens in the Vulgate, it becomes alabastrum, which can be either stone or a type of vessel. It's ambiguous, but it's not alabaster. The Greek clearly says an alabastron. It's a neuter word for a vessel. And it can be ceramic or glass, but it's a perfume jar, and so on. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. Oh my word. Could you get more publicly erotic than that without going the full Monty? I mean, this is so erotic. All right. Could you handle this? She's wiping her beautiful hair, perfumed hair, all over his feet, which are also kind of wet with tears. Oh, this is too much. I doubt many of us men could handle it. I could make exceptions, of course, but this is really something else. It was very expensive, and when you read the other synoptic gospels, it says the vessel was worth 300 denarii, and not the vessel, but the perfume, that this act was expensive. 300 denarii is about a year's wages, and who can afford a year's wages of perfume wasted like this? Wow, this is too much. Oh, you can see right there. Well, it doesn't say how expensive it was, but then Jesus talks about forgiveness. Now, interesting. Jesus said, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears, wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered does not stop kissing my feet. Wow. Okay. You did not put oil on my head. She's poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven. Her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. Whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Right, Donald? Anyway, so on. So now, interesting story. And again, other Gospels say this is Mary Magdalene. So is that really the confrontation? Is that the worst possible sort of erotic encounter? Well, Nikos Kazantzakis, as you know, in The Last Temptation of Christ, takes it much further than that. And I would say, crosses the line if you want to think about heresy. But here is the actual perfume. It's nard, Nardostachys, either balsami or jadomsni. Jadomsni. That is mostly a Tibetan plant, but there was a Near Eastern plant, which was the source of equal volume of perfume. A desert plant also that has a very high viscosity because of doesn't have a lot of moisture in it, but very, very incredible perfume and very expensive. And what you would do with the perfume is you'd take the rosin or the juices of the plant and you would put it in olive oil, suspended in olive oil, in a vessel. And to keep the perfume intact from desiccating, because it loses its essence pretty quickly in the air, you suspend this olive oil and then you break the vessel or unstopper it, and then it releases its perfume. So it's a one-off. So you can't really keep it. It's a one-off, and that's why it's so expensive. Here it's just, this is from the Tarquinian Museum in Italy. I took this picture a couple of years ago, showing some of these types of alabastra. Now, some of them, and you can't tell here, but you can seal them. If they're long enough, like test tubes, you can put a glass stopper and then heat it up to seal it. So you have to break it to release the perfume. And that's what happened. It was an alabastron. So it mitigates, it denigrates the value of the perfume by saying it was alabaster, even though that becomes the symbol of Mary Magdalene, an alabaster jar, usually. Although Caravaggio gets it right. I'm not sure if you've seen this in the Galleria d'Oro Pamphili in Rome. Caravaggio, because Cardinal Francesco Maria Borba del Monte was one of the most sophisticated prelates in the church, highly literate. His godfather, by the way, was Titian, and his family was very erudite. He was educated at the same school in Urbino as Torquatus Tasso, the great Italian poet, and others. Very well-educated man, had an incredible collection of musical instruments, classical antiquities. For a while, he owned the Portland vase, the most famous cameo vase in the world, a Roman cameo glass. So Del Monte certainly had some alabastra. And so what, Bellori, who was a critic, hated Caravaggio, said, this isn't Mary Magdalene. He just painted this woman sitting in a room with wet hair, looking disconsolate. But if you look closely, as Bellori didn't, it really is about Mary Magdalene according to the Gospels. This is the penitent Magdalene. And if you look closely, everything there in the story shows that Caravaggio read closely the story as well as the Book of Martyrs and the Legenda Aurea, the golden legends about Mary and others. Now, she was said to have had red hair, luxurious, thick red hair. And here you could just barely see a tear coming down her cheek. It's not really very obvious. It's about right there. Can you see it barely? And this is not the voluptuous Mary that you often see. But there is the so-called vessel, and she is literally the vessel. Isn't that interesting? You look at it. See, the vessel at the base of her skirt, but she's the vessel. She's even holding her arms as if she's containing something like a vessel. But then if you look down on the floor next to her, down here, you see the rest of the story. There. There is the jar of perfume. Now, of course, Caravaggio is showing his virtuosity with light through liquid and glass. It couldn't be more perfect as a painter, where all the reflection is, including coming off the bottom of the glass, off the window, off the surface, and so on. But that's what the perfume looks like. Nardo Stacus Balsami, or Getsemani, is this golden perfume. And notice what she's done. She's abandoned her luxurious life. She's taken off all her jewelry. Do you see it? So there she's taken off all her jewelry, all of her fine luxuries, and she's abandoning this life as a penitent. But if you look closely, there are earrings and belts and so on. But right here, intriguingly, are a string of pearls. And pearls, because they're from the sea, a gift of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who was born on a seashell, they're often associated with Venus or Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Now, if you look closely at the pearls, it's broken in the appropriate place, because tradition tells us that Mary Magdalene met Jesus at age 20 and then lived 16 more years, went to Provence and so on. And if you look at where the break in the pearls are, it's exactly at 20 and 16. Caravaggio knew his stuff. Well, whatever, Mary Magdalene is this trope for the ultimate temptation. And you can look at the Gnostic Gospels if you wish. They're really too late to be in any way credible. But Mary was the one who had a cognizance of Jesus in the New Testament scriptures that show a proximity to truth and to Christ. But you also notice there's in the last part of the Gospel of Matthew where it says, "Do not touch me." And then usually that's translated from the Vulgate as "Noli me tangere," do not touch me. But that's not really what it says. It's don't cling to me in the Greek. Don't cling to me. Well, as I said, theologically, Mary provides this necessary crux for the ultimate temptation of Christ. That if in Christianity Christ sins, then it negates the deity, because can't sin. If he wasn't tempted, he can't really, in the theology, be the advocate, be the scapegoat, if he's not tempted to the ultimate. So there's a lot of theology resting, and this story provides, as I said, a foil, a necessary crux for Christ's temptation, as well as his forgiveness. So that's part of the story, but let's leave it at that. And however erudite Caravaggio was, and Cardinal Del Monte was, nonetheless, this translation is wrong when it says alabaster vessel. It's alabastron, a glass or ceramic vessel, most likely glass. Now, she becomes, as I said, the penitent. Most of the translations show her as this voluptuary, very often the alabaster vessel somewhere, also the mortality implied in the skull. Donatello's version is, of course, that she becomes a great ascetic. But the transformation of sinner to saint is intriguing because Peter's sin in denying Christ. Paul calls himself the chief of sinners because he caused people to blaspheme. Literally, he tormented and tortured to death Christians. And then, as I said, Augustine. So really, maybe to be a great saint, you have to be first a great sinner. I'll leave you with that. Heresy. All right, let's jump, though, and let's go to some of the Aramaisms that don't quite come out. Now, everybody knows this enigmatic statement of Jesus, where he says, "Verily, verily, I tell you." Verily, verily is a Greek phrase, aletheia, and then it can be aleithei, which is the way in Hebrew you make a superlative. You take the singular and then you take the plural and you add them together, like battle of battles, meaning the greatest of all battles, or truly, truly. Aleithia, aleithia, aleithei. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of God. Now, if you've been to Jerusalem, people will take you on a little narrow passage through the streets of Jerusalem. They'll say, here's the eye of the needle. It's this really narrow passage, and you have to almost squeeze sideways. Well, that's ridiculous, because they're taking you through 20th or medieval Jerusalem, and the Roman Jerusalem is about 15 feet below. And it's not about a place in Jerusalem. It's a metaphor, and it's a Hebrew wordplay or Aramaic wordplay, because the word for camel in Hebrew and in Aramaic is gamal, and the word for eye of the needle is gamla. Now, right here, I have something called a gimlet. It's getting stretched these days, I'm afraid. But you see that gimlet? That's the Hebrew singular feminine. You add an et to something, gimlet. That's a Hebrew feminine word. Gamla. Gamla becomes gimlet, the eye of a needle, or a buttonhole, if you want to call it that. It's easier for a gamal to go through a gamla. Now, there are different possibilities. Gamla could also be a type of rope. But there is the gamal, the camel, and there is the gamla. And you see how it's a wordplay? You just metathesize two letters. A-L becomes L-A. Gamal, gamla. Isn't that brilliant? Well, it's a wordplay. It's a figure of speech. It's not a reality. Although, I suppose, if we could go on with this, there are different interpretations. There's a Hebrew midrash on the Song of Songs, uses this basically same phrase about an eye of a needle, and about, you can see it. The Holy One said, open for me a door as big as a needle's eye, and I will open for you a door through which may enter tents and camels. Now, we don't know exactly how old this midrash is, if it predates Jesus or not. But evidently, it also a gamla can be a type of rope, a rope enclosure. Whatever the case, I suppose if you find a needle big enough or a camel small enough, it'll work, right? But the point isn't that it's impossible, it's just easier for, you see. It's a comparative statement. And while it may seem absurd, it's a wordplay. And I think many things Jesus said are wordplays that make more sense in Hebrew than they do in Greek, like this one. Well, here's another one that's interesting. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A lot of the Pharisees went around saying, we're rich in spirit. We're really spiritual. And it would make sense. Blessed is a positive. Rich is a positive. Spirit is a positive. Kingdom is a positive. And heaven is a positive. They're all positives. But Jesus turned it upside down. He took out the word rich in this common parlance, this common saying of Pharisees, and said instead, blessed are the poor. Completely reversed it. It totally takes the one word, rich, and reverses it. Now, if you look at it in Greek, you can see, by the way, the word for blessed in Greek, you actually know this word. If you know what holy pasta is in Italy, what's holy pasta? It comes from the Greek, macaroni. Well done, whoever said that. Macaroni is a special pasta for holy days. Macaroni, but it comes from the Greek word makarioi, blessed. Poor, the word for poor in Greek here is the word ptokoi, P-T-O-C-H-O-I. It means beggar. Not poor, but beggar. And it's a direct translation from the Hebrew. Spirit here is about pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, Kingdom is the word coming from basileia, king, basileus. Heaven, of course, is the word we'd get for heaven about the uranu, the heaven. But actually, it's taken from Aramaic. So here's the Greek. Makarioi hoiptokoi topmati oti auton esten he basileia ton uranon. So the first word here is blessed, makarioi. Ptokoi is beggar. Blessed are the beggars in spirit. Okay? Pneumati. Because to them, hoti auton, is the kingdom, he basileia, ton uranon, of heaven. So you've got all these positives. Blessed is a positive, spirit is a positive, kingdom is a positive, and heaven is a positive. But Jesus took out the word rich instead here, the plutosi, and instead it comes as poor. Now the Aramaic is even better. So there are the words, the blessed words are in gold. Ptokoi is that word flaming out. Ptokoi, blessed are the beggars in spirit. For them is the kingdom of heaven. And essentially, if you look at it, so there's the word plusios that he took out. The rich, blessed are the rich in spirit, from the common saying. Here it is in Hebrew. Now the word for blessed is asher. There it is at the top. Asheri. And then you can have this word the H is white. And then you have this word kibatznim, poor. But it's more than just poor, it's beggars. Baruah, in spirit, for to them, because, ki lachem, to them. Then you have malakot, shemayim, kingdom of heaven. So what Jesus does with this is the word right here in orange, it's beggars. So why are beggars blessed? Because they're having their hands out. They have to admit they're beggars. The beggars are saying, help me. And what Jesus is saying, it's the ones who say, help me, who are blessed in the kingdom of heaven. Is that not intriguing? That to many would be heresy. But you can see why, if you hear it in Aramaic and you know the word kabbas, it's not just generic poor, it's beggars. And I think most of us are really turned off by beggars, if we're honest, right? I walk around too often, that guy with his hand out, sitting on the corner, who might not even smell like, the wonderful, perfumes of France and so on. I think we know that beggars are helpless. And that's the crux here. It makes much more sense in Aramaic. Isn't this interesting? Because it's only those who ask for help who get it. Those who don't think they need it won't ask for it. Intriguing. Now, enough heresy, right? Okay, so there is the interesting word. What Jesus took out in the Aramaic was this word, and you can tell it was a common parlance wordplay because look at the difference. This is blessed, asheri. This is rich, asher, but it's with an aleph instead of an ayin. You see the difference? It's a wordplay, and he knew it full well. It was a common wordplay, and he substitutes a word which is a double wordplay. Asher, asher. This is the asher blessed. This is the asher of wealthy, of rich. Intriguing, isn't it? All right, so much for that. Let's go to another bad word, Beelzebub. Baal, remember, is the word for Lord or God. Zebub is an interesting word. Let's look at it. So this is the Greek version of the Aramaic, Baal Zebub. And so he sticks it together. So that can mean Lord, and you'll know what this means very quickly. So let's go to Baal. Oh, I thought I'd throw this one in too. Okay, might as well lighten it up a bit, right? There's heavy stuff today. Now here's Beelzebub. I don't know if you saw the great movie Time Bandits, kind of done in the Monty Python school. Terry Gilliam, etc. I don't know if you love Terry Gilliam movies. Brazil, 12 Monkeys. You could go on and on and on about his movies, but Time Bandits is one of them. Baron Munchausen is another. I love Terry Gilliam. And here is the ultimate evil. There he is, who's actually in the movie all about commercial consumption. And then there's Gustave Doré's, needs an accent aigu over the E, Lucifer's fall from Paradise Lost. Now here's Jesus saying, if Satan is divided against himself, how will his kingdom stand? Because you say that I cast out devils through Beelzebub. It's a good logical question to ask. Well, Beelzebub, Jesus uses this name, Beelzebub. What is Beelzebub? I don't know if you've read Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, or Gurdjieff on the good ship Beelzebub or whatever. Worth reading philosophically, but there we go. Oh, I had to throw in another Trump cartoon. Right. Sorry, I think my politics are showing today. All right. Now, there is Beelzebub. Remember, in Hatzor, I showed you this image before. That is an altar where human sacrifice, tiny babies were put on that altar, and it's quite huge. It's about 6 feet tall. Here's Beelzebub too. Remember, copper, when it's fresh and unoxidized, is red and has horns, so you can see this popular picture of the devil coming out of ancient Baal sculptures, perhaps. Now, Baal, what is interesting, Beelzebub, because there was always roasted flesh around these statues, it attracted flies to burning meat. So Beelzebub means what? Lord of the flies. That's what it means. Zebub, of the flies. William Golding certainly knew that, talking about human degradation and how we tear ourselves apart with our imperfections. So Lord of the flies, that's Beelzebub, Zebub, of the flies. All right. So much of the Greek makes more sense when you put it back into Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. And you'd understand all the connotations. All right, so much for that. Now, we haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet, because I want to go today to Athens and to Corinth, and then to Pergamon and Ephesus. So we better take our break right now. And please, quickly. Okay. No Lord of the Flies for us today. Let's move on. Talk about that more. All right. Okay, folks. I don't see that there's been a max exodus from my heresy. But so many of you came up and wanted to talk about Mary Magdalene. Quite a persona, isn't she? There's no question that the Mary Magdalene story shows that Jesus had a very special place for women amongst the closest circle of his disciples. And I think you can find throughout either the Jewish scriptures as well as the New Testament, you can find a very different standard about the treatment of women. Remember Moses and the 7 daughters of Zelophehad, who get their inheritance and it doesn't go to their male heirs. Anyway, we could go on and on about this. There was someone in the ochre, not ochre, but sort of mutard there. What was you made a comment? I want to come back to it. Please share it with everybody, or just remind me what you said. There was something else you said too. That's hamartula. It's not just woman in a one-off act of adultery. It's a woman who, it's her life, it's her habitude. Okay, but there was something else that you said. The other thing was... Yeah, but there was something else you said too that was really good. That's the Michael Lay Badgent book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And intriguingly, I think you may know this, but although the Bourbon French royal house, to which many of us here are probably related, it's likely, it's logical. I know in my family that was a claim. I think you could find it. But The Bourbon house believed, at least privately, that they were the literal physical descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Did you know that? Yeah, and yet they claim to be Christian, which seems like a complete, that kind of totally undermines the whole Christian idea. But whatever. As I said, we're gonna probably step on some toes today, and I apologize in advance. And please flagellate me if I do. Okay. Now let's jump though to Athens and Corinth very quickly. We've got some time to run through these. One of the points I've tried to make throughout this course is that archaeology doesn't prove the Bible true. Please don't assume I'm meaning that. What archaeology does very often is show the credibility of the historical nature of these texts. And while you could find problems throughout, you can also find many synchronisms where texts and extra biblical information are saying the same thing. That's where I think archaeology can illuminate the time frame and the culture of this period, so that when you look at biblical material, you're seeing a culture, you're seeing a time frame, and you're seeing a language which we don't share. Different time, different culture, different language, different place. 4 filters removed from us. And yet, we can remove some of those filters by going back to these places and seeing quite a bit of material. Now, let's go, though, to Athens. I love this Byzantine mosaic because you can see the aureole, nimbus, or halo around Paul. But you probably already know that part of that you don't really see if you read in the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament Greek. You don't see the word halo or nimbus or aureole. This is borrowed from Buddhism and from Asia. And you even see here, Paul has the forehead borrowed from Asia of sort of one of the sages of China, this gigantic forehead, because he was such a cerebral guy, wasn't he? Well, he was definitely an argumentative guy. He was definitely pugnacious. What's his symbol? A sword. Paul loved a fight, and he loved an argument, but whatever. Here you see him with the forehead of a Chinese sage. And you don't see it here, but very often you see this symbol, this blessing symbol. Well, it's derived again from the mudra of Buddha, the blessing of Buddha, although it's not shown here. There's a lot of east-west diffusion going on, and the art often picks up the form without keeping the function. That's just a given. But Paul, let's look at some of his travels. Now, I think, Paul was at least bilingual in Hebrew, Aramaized Hebrew, and Greek. He was trained in a rabbinic school under Gamaliel, who was one of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And Gamaliel was the cautionary rabbi in the Sanhedrin who urged always, let's calm down the rhetoric and let's not persecute people who don't think the same way we do. So Gamaliel was pretty sound, but Paul was pretty rabid in his early days. He was also trained as a rhetor, as a Greek lawyer. He was from Tarsus in Anatolia, which was a Roman colony, so he probably knew some Latin too. He certainly knew Roman law because he claims his Roman citizenship and the rights pertaining to it. So Paul is a well-educated guy for his day, but trained as a Pharisee in Torah, trained as a Greek-Roman lawyer, rhetor as well. That's kind of unusual. But when you read his legal treatises, particularly the book of Romans, the epistle to the Romans, you can see the legal arguments coming out. He's using a lot of legalese for the day. But now, there are the Greek schools of philosophy, Platonism, skepticism, cynicism, stoicism, Epicureanism, and then the sort of bastard child of Epicureanism, which was hedonism. And to go through them a little bit, we'll talk about Plato. You know that Platonism and Plato was, of course, executed for heresy because he was said not to believe in the gods. And he denies that when at his apology, the Apologia, where he says that he expects a better fate from the judges of the afterlife and the gods than he does from the ones in this world. It was a hung jury almost in Athens. It wasn't even a huge majority that voted against him. But Plato also believed in his ideals and the shadow world, that there were absolutes and realities that were beyond our empirical ability to see, hear, smell, taste, touch. He really believed that there was reality outside the five senses. Read the Symposium and you'll see that very clearly. You'll see it elsewhere too. And of course, we're talking about Socrates here, who is the instigator of Plato's writing things down. We don't know, we can't always distinguish between Plato and Socrates. Maybe some of it is Plato. I was just at the cave of the philosophers in Crete, where the mysteries of the philosophers were basically initiated, and we tried to reinstigate them. It was quite fun in the snow on Mount Ida in Crete in March. And I believe that that's the cave also that comes into the allegory of the cave of Plato, but I won't go into that detail. Neoplatonism comes into Christianity very clearly. John's Gospel begins with it. The Logos. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And he deifies the Logos, the Word. That Logos is part of Plato, and Neoplatonism is also appearing many places in Paul, and very strongly in the Epistle to the Hebrews, about that the earthly tabernacle is the shadow of the heavenly tabernacle. So very clearly, Platonic thought crept into Christianity very well. In fact, Plato is considered to be kind of a pre-Christian by many. And you can see the Neoplatonism in Florence, particularly the Neoplatonica Theologica of Marsilio Ficino. So I could go into hours about how Platonism was the basis, as we know, for much philosophy. That's often what, if you read the encyclopedias of philosophy, they often say philosophy starts with Plato. Well, rather than go too much into that, the school of skepticism, which is running counter to the Greek cults of the gods, the popular religion of the Greeks, with its insistence on many things of piety, the skeptics found that problematic. We don't know how many skeptics there were, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were as many skeptics as believers in Greek religion in the time of Paul. Many, maybe more. But of course, cynicism, which is an interesting word, the word kaine, comes from the word dog, because the cynics believe that dogs are as profound as any philosopher when they bark. That's pretty skeptical, right? That's cynical, right? So the school of the cynics, the school of the dogs, because dogs were pretty much pared down to the basics. And the founder of the school of the cynics, Antisthenes, said something, however, very intriguing, which you might not think is cynical. Then the Stoics, that's supposed to be Stoicism. It always bugs me when there's a letter missing, so we're going to fix that there. Okay, thank you. Now, the Stoics comes from the word for stoa, and Chrysippus, and then Zeno the Eleatic promote this school. The Stoics were very different. The Stoics kind of also were very skeptical, almost agnostic. When you read Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, you can see good Stoic thought, where the Stoics felt the religion was problematic, that it created a lot of evil in the world, and they felt that sort of the tough it out, grin and bear it, don't let your emotions rule. Keep a stiff upper lip type of idea. But one of the best expressions of Stoicism in late antiquity is, of course, Marcus Aurelius, when you read his statements. But Epicurus was a different kind of philosopher too, who basically said to all the other people who wanted to study with him, look, if you want to be a philosopher, come dig with me, work with me in my garden, weed, prune, cultivate. And his school was that a little of the best is better than a lot of the worst. He would much prefer a little bit of Lindt chocolate to Hershey's big, milk chocolate, no doubt. That an Epicurean is saying that an Epicurean, I think my mother was a bit Epicurean, she said the good is the enemy of the best. The good is the enemy of the best. Yeah, anyway, now, Epicureanism, though, because that a little pleasure should go a long way, the hedonists took it much further and said, no, we will live for pleasure. Hedone, the word for pleasure. So these are the Greek school of philosophy that are current. And of course, this is a picture I took in the British Museum of these four great philosophers, Socrates, Antisthenes, Chrysippus, and Epicurus. Now, Antisthenes said something quite intriguing. He said this. In Greek, it was the first thing I learned in beginning Greek in university. Athanatos hepsuke. Thanatos is death. Athanatos means deathless. Athanatos hepsuke. Deathless is the soul. This is the father of the school of the Cynics, Antisthenes, who said the soul never dies. That's cynical. Yes, relative to the fervent piety of the other Greeks. Isn't that interesting that the school of the Cynics father said that? Now, Chrysippus taught, as did Zeno the Eleatic, they taught in the stoas of the Agora. And the stoas are spacious places, porticos under which you can sit and get out of the hot sun, and you'll see that. Also, Epicurus' garden, intriguingly, I'll come back to. So there is the Stoa of Attalus. I took that picture in March because I was just there. That's the reconstructed Stoa of Attalus. It's now the headquarters of the American School of Classical Studies in the Agora. And I was a graduate school member there, the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Do you see how many people you could fit in that? You could fit hundreds of people if you had a good enough voice projection, and the sound could be contained. So this is where the philosophers who were Stoics taught, and taught their basic ideas of counter to popular piety. Now, that's today, I took that picture again in March. If you go to the National Garden of Athens, not too far from the Presidential Palace, not too far from the Syntagma Square, Constitutional Square, this huge garden area is both where Epicurus' garden was and where Plato's Academy was. The Academe, under the oak tree, the great oak tree and the plane trees. And there you see a great oak, hundreds of years old, maybe thousands of years old. Interesting, Epicurus said, come work with me in my garden. Learn what weeding is, because you do what? You weed yourself as well. Prune yourself. Learn what nature does. Learn the humility of working in a garden. I kind of like that. What did Edith Wharton say? Civilized people, the mark of a civilized person is their gardeners. All right, well, you can see where my tastes lie. But interestingly, Voltaire in Candide finishes with what? Let us each cultivate our own garden, not somebody else's. All right, so Voltaire is very cognizant of Epicureanism. Let us each cultivate our own garden. All right, so a lot going on there. I'm just providing context. Now, from the Acropolis, from the Propylaeum, I took this picture looking down on Mars Hill. This is Mars Hill, Areopagus in Greek, Ares, Mars, Pagus, hill. This is the hill of Mars. And in Paul's time, all the philosophers met here. This was the ancient court of the homicides, where in Aeschylus' Oresteia trilogy, Aeschylus provides the reason why Athena becomes the juror who breaks the tie between the chorus the harpies, or not the harpies, the furies, the Erinyes, who then become the Eumenides, the kindly ones. So it's not about blood vengeance anymore. It's about circumstantial evidence and evidential pursuit and about extenuating circumstances and so on. It was the school of jurisprudence today coming from that hill. And it's also where all the philosophers gathered. The Stoics, the Epicureans, the skeptics and cynics, they gathered there. And Paul, in his sermon on Mars Hill, in Acts 17, says, you people of Athens, I see how religious you are. Everywhere I go, I see religious statues. And it's true. The entire Agora is filled to this day with statue bases and shrines, and as well as the entire Acropolis, a lot of gods. He even says you had a god that you didn't know. That's really hedging your bets. You even have a statue to the unknown god. That's really careful. Antony Raubitschek believed that was sort of a possible statue to just a generic Deus Filius, son of a god, which was often a title of Caesar's. There's no Theos Ignotus. There's no statue been found of an unknown god. But it is reasonable that the Athenians would hedge their bets. Nonetheless, Paul then at Mars Hill speaks to all those philosophers. If you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, you'll see Raphael's huge cartoons that are bigger than this screen by far of Paul's preaching to the Athenians. And one of them, Dionysius the Areopagite, meaning he really dwelt on that hill. He is the one convert Paul gets out of those philosophers. The break point is when Paul starts talking about the resurrection. Although he quotes Aratus and he quotes the phenomena, he quotes Greek poets and so on and so on. Paul's an educated guy, but very marginalizing, true. Now, here, let's leave Athens if we can, and let's go now, let's go across the isthmus to Corinth, and you can see, if you're a seafarer, why Corinth is a really important place. Corinthos is a very old Greek word. Any Greek word that has inth in it, in a masculine singular, inthos, that's a really old morpheme. Inthos means place, like labyrinthos or plinthos. A plinth, Corinth, labyrinth, means place of. Inthos. So Kor means probably the maiden, Kore, the place of the maiden. It's hard to prove that, but it's such an old word in Proto-Greek, we don't know. But if you're a sailor, you love this place for multiple reasons. You'd sail across the Adriatic, and instead of going all the way down here between Cape Malea and the island here of Kythera and Antikythera, this is a place where there are 300 shipwrecks at least found. University of Cambridge expeditions, even people drown, divers drown, because it's a really bad place to try to do nautical archaeology. But you avoid this at all costs. Propertius, the Roman poet, says, if you want to live, avoid Cape Malea. So instead of going around the Cape, and George Bass, who was the president and director and founder of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, told me one day that his most dangerous passage he ever made across the Mediterranean was on a ferry trying to get around this cape, because the ferry just about completely got swallowed. The counter currents of wind and water and cliffs, it's a bad place even today. I don't know if you've ever been in a storm in the Mediterranean. They can be nasty, real gales. But by the way, Lionel Casson, very famous classicist, came to my house once for dinner. He was the head of the California Classical Association Speakers Bureau that we picked when I was the president. And his synagogue in New York is a famous one. He lived on Bleecker Street as well. But Lionel Casson told me the best absolute account of a shipwreck in the ancient world is the account in Acts 26-27 in Paul's shipwreck. He said it's the best, most credible account of a shipwreck you'll ever see in ancient literature. But anyway, and possibly written by Luke or the Lucan school or whatever. But intriguingly, you avoid this cape. Instead, you come through the Gulf of Corinth out to the Gulf of Salamis. And Nero wanted to dig a canal across here, but his engineers told him he'd flood the world if he did. So leave that to the French in the 19th century. But it's a 3-mile span, and there was a diolkos. There was literally a grooved passageway for carts. The ships could either unload everything and take them across the 3-mile isthmus and pick it up on the other side at Cancrea Isthmia and carry it on towards the Aegean, or they could hoist these ships on a cart or carts and pull them over. That diolkos is still there, the grooved road. But Corinth was very famous. Strabo said, wealthy, wealthy Corinth. Literally, every sailor in the ancient world wanted to stop off in Corinth. It had some famous reasons why. Very rich. Now, that's, I guess, my picture of Corinth from March. This is the Acrocorinth. This is the Temple of Apollo, Doric temple. A lot of things to see. Down on the other side of the hill over here is the Bema. This is kind of on a rise. Right here, there's the Museum of Corinth. And up at the top, there is both what's called a Frankish castle up here and others, but right up here at the top of the Acrocorinth was a temple to the goddess Aphrodite. Now, I'll talk more about that temple to Aphrodite. It made Corinth very, very famous. Now, here is my picture of the great Lernaean street, the street that goes all the way to the water. There's the Acrocorinth again. And over here you have the Pyrene Spring. And up here, I'll show you this better, is a temple to Demeter and Kore up on the hill. This is the Sacred Way, the Lernaean street. It goes all the way up and above the hill and comes all the way to the top to the Temple of Aphrodite. Now here's ancient Corinth a little bit after Paul's time, but it shows the great agora, or as you'd call it in Roman times, the Forum. And here is the Bema, the judgment seat. That's the temple of Apollo. There are many other temples. Here's the great theater right here. The Pyrene Fountain is technically this area right in here, and there's that street I just showed you that goes to the coast, to the north. The Gulf of Corinth is down here to the north. Here's the great theater, and right down here there's a pavement, a very famous pavement that I'll show you. It was put in by the city treasurer, Archarius, or what's known as oikonomikos, the aedile in Roman times, Aedile, the director of public works. So I'm just going to show you a few of these things. So here's Corinth slightly post-Paul. And we know that according to the book of Acts, Paul in Acts 18 and so on stayed there for technically quite a while, months, maybe a year and a half. Now, here's the Bema seat right here. Now, we're not sure completely if this is the place where Paul would have been brought, but it's clearly where some people were brought for judgment under Gallio, who's the brother of Seneca, and he's the governor at the time. And that's literally true. We know this. Pavements have been found to show that he was the procurator of Achaia, the province of the Peloponnesus. This is the Peloponnesus. Let me just show you real quick. That's the Peloponnesus right here. All this is the Peloponnesus, and Corinth was the headquarters of it. So the governor would have lived in Corinth. And Achaia is the same word, literally, as Virgil uses and Homer uses, and it's an old Mycenaean word for Achaiawa, the Mycenaeans. But anyway, now here, the Bema where the governor would have sat in judgment. Here is a very famous pavement, or actually not a pavement, part of an architrave, and it literally says in Greek, Gamma, Omega, Gamma, Gog, and then Hebra, meaning the synagogue of the Jews. And it was there in Corinth. Now, there were 3 different levels, and this is a slightly later level, and Greek is falling apart by this time. but you can't quite see. There's the A for synagogue. You see the A's left residual there? So this is the synagogue of the Jews in Corinth, and this is the later version, Paul's first century version, was underneath this, and that foundation has been found. Now, when I was a member of the American School of Classical Studies, we went to Corinth, and the director of the program there, of the American School of Classical Studies, was Charles Williams, and then his assistant, Nancy Boukidis. And I had lots of questions, and then when I was there back again multiple times, including just a few months ago in March, I got to revisit and talk to some of my old teachers. So here's the Synagogue of the Jews, and the American School controls this site. There's that same street with the, over here is the Pyrene Fountain, where in mythology, Pegasus' hoof clipped the hill and the spring came up. There's the Acrocorinth, and there's the podium for the Temple of Apollo. And this street, the Sacred Way, goes all the way up the hill. And you can see a little bit of it right there. Now, there is the temple. So let me just go back. Right there is the site of the sanctuary of Demeter and Kore. Demeter, the goddess of grain, and Kore, the maiden, her daughter. Kore is the young spring grain. Demeter, the mother, is the full head of golden grain. And so they're both spring and harvest combined, Demeter and Kore. So there is the temple right here. There's the temple with the sanctuary. And Nancy Boukidis, the director, told me that when the Romans came in 146 BCE, they stopped a practice that was part of the sort of cult of Demeter and Kore. And that was the animal that you sacrificed to Greek gods and goddesses. What is the common animal you sacrifice? Here it is on the picture. A pig, a huas, or hua, in the case of Antiochus Epiphanes or Epimanes. Remember, he sacrificed a female pig on the altar in Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation. So pigs are commonly sacrificed. And, pigs are easy meat. They grow fast. They'll eat anything. They have lots of piglets. And so pig, common animal sacrifice, what the Greeks would do, they would have a feast after the sacrifice of the pigs. And anybody who's part of the apparatus, locals, visitors, whatever, would come and they would eat on literally on the premises. They would have this feast of pork. You can just imagine a lot of bacon, a lot of barbecue, a lot of roast pig, right? So what happened, the Romans came and many practices stopped, including this one. So they stopped. They still sacrificed the pigs, but they no longer feasted on the premises. Instead, the meat was sold for extra revenue to the public. This happened in 146 BC onward. So 146 BCE onward, the pig meat is no longer consumed. Nancy Boukidis showed me the pits where they dug all the pig bones out. And stratigraphically, it stops at 146 BCE. I even found a pig bone up in the Aphrodite sanctuary, a little knuckle bone, astragalus, that they played games with. They flipped the knuckle bone. But anyway, there's Nancy. I just took a picture with her 2 months ago. She didn't have white hair when I was her student in 1984, but I probably was not the thick oak that I am today either. So there is Nancy, the excavator of that sanctuary. We had a nice conversation. Now there you can see the sanctuary up on the hill, and interestingly, and then way up at the top was the Temple of Aphrodite. So let's take this little by little. I think that Paul's letters to the Corinthians are a treasure trove of Corinthian data. Now there's an image, a very subdued image of Aphrodite. You don't see all of her. Remember those old, what was it, Bristol Shave commercials? Take it off, take it all off, which you can't show on TV today, or could you? Maybe you could. But here you just see the head of Aphrodite. There are a lot of statues where literally you see everything, because she's the only Greek goddess who can be shown after the classical era naked, completely naked. Now, there's the top of the Acrocorinth, and that's what's left of the Temple of Aphrodite, rejumbled and you can see bits of it. This is a mishmash. This is what's left of the temple, and it's all out of order. Xenophon, the great writer who fled with his mercenaries from Persia, wrote the Anabasis, the journey from Persia through the desert to the Black Sea. And you may recall the famous phrase in it, to the sea, we see the sea. That's thalassa, thalassa, or thalata, thalata in the Attic dialect. Thalassa would be the Doric dialect. And so Xenophon was so overjoyed to get out of the desert and to get to the sea, he gave 1,000 slave girls to be temple prostitutes to Aphrodite here in Corinth. 1,000 temple prostitutes. So 1,000 courtesans. And essentially, Corinth was famous for this reason, amongst others. That's why all the sailors loved to go there, to the temple of Aphrodite, because you paid for your worship of the goddess of love. It was a very accommodating cult. Now, when you go to the Asclepion, which is the sanctuary of the healing gods, the god Asclepios, I'll come back to that. This says, in Greek, here's someone who had a bum leg, and it says, to Asclepius, Asclepio, that's a Greek lunate sigma from which we get our letter C today. It's an S, hence sa in C. But Asclepio, to Asclepius, and Hygeia. We get our word hygiene from the daughter of Asclepius, the goddess of cleanliness. So Asclepius is the god of medicine. Hygeia is his daughter. To lucky, the lucky, Hygeia Tyche, so good fortune bringing Tyche. It says Efcharisterion. If you're going to say thank you in Greek today, what is it? Efcharisto. It means charis is grace, X-A-R-I-S, that's grace. Means true or good. So when you say thank you, you're saying true grace or good grace. So thank you. So thank you, Asclepius and fortune-bringing Tyche, for healing my leg. That's what this says. Now, at the Asclepia, and Corinth had one, wherever you go to this god of healing, you donate the body part that's sick or ill, and you make a clay votive of it. And then you go through all this rigmarole, and the god heals you, maybe. Or you lay down and have a dream, and the god comes in your dream. So these are all the body parts. And it's interesting. I've been to many Asclepia, and Corinth has the highest number of sex organs that had problems. Seriously. A lot of genitalia and sex organs. There are a lot of uterus here, and you can kind of make out some of these things there. Okay, and you can see Asclepia here. You can see it written. So people had problems, and they had more venereal disease, apparently, the disease of Venus, Aphrodite. This is a picture I took of it. And again, just look across the wall here and see if you can figure out what those are. More in Corinth of venereal disease than any other Asclepion. I wonder why. Now, quickly, this is a famous pavement. That's my picture of it, but you can find better ones. And it says, Erastus pro idelite sua pecunia strawit. Okay, I just took this in March. Kind of upside down because you can't get over it easily. But here's a better image of it when it's been cleaned up. So Erastus. Erastus is the name of a person. Pro means for or during. Ideal. A-E-D-I-L-E, and it's idealite, for his idealship, meaning director of public works. The wealthy citizen who's the director of public works has to pay for something out of his own pocket. And he paved this, it says, sua pecunia, with his own money, paved this, strawit. Now, Erastus is mentioned in Romans 16:23. Erastus, director of the city public works. He's mentioned as this wealthy person in Corinth, directly mentioned. Kent, who excavated this in 1936, long history of this being identified as the director of public works in the year 48 CE, exactly when Paul was there. So it's it's a given that it's the same person. I don't think anybody in the classical studies doubts this whatsoever. Nice to have your name written on the pavement and then in the book of Romans, right? Anyway, now Corinthian bronze, famous metal. The best bronze in the ancient world. Sometimes it had a bit of gold put in it, and it turned a purplish tinge. Medical doctors had really good medical instruments with purple Corinthian bronze, this particular alloy. It's a curious oxidizing process when the gold works this. But that's a Corinthian helmet made out of one piece of bronze. Now, Corinth had a lot of Isis. If you read Apuleius' Metamorphoses, the Golden Ass, you realize that it's at Corinth that he makes his vow to Isis. Isis, the Roman Egyptian goddess, whose musical instrument, is the sistrum. There it is, right there. It's a kind of a jangly thing. Makes a lot of, you don't see little discs, but they were musical discs that you ring like a bell. So that's a sistrum. It was famous for Corinthian bronze, famous for musical instruments. So let's go here now. So here is Corinth. Across the Gulf of Corinth is Delphi and Levadia, two great oracles. And way over here is the oracle Dodona. Now, here, Paul says, 1 Corinthians 1, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or clanging cymbal. I'm only a piece, he's saying to Corinthians, I'm only a piece of your bronze musical instruments. He's making a direct reference to their bronze industry. And then he says later on, now about food sacrificed to idols. We know that so on. He's directly referencing the food that people bought, the meat that was sacrificed to Demeter and Kore that had been consumed in the temple and now is sold in the marketplace. Now I could show you many parts that all you need to do is look deep around the culture and the time and the context, and this stuff pops out at you from the stories. Now here at the top of the Acra Corinth, this is where the temple was, and you look across, Dodona is way out of the picture, but here's Parnassus and Delphi and Mount Helicon, and so the oracles. Corinth is famous for what? All around Corinth are glossolalia. Glossolalia is a word for tongues. People would speak in these divine languages. And glossolalia, very, very common. Here's a picture I took of Mount Parnassus in March, and at the base of it, to this side over here under Mount Helicon, is the oracle of Levadia, of Trophonius, where the priests would listen to the water burbling through the rocks and carving out little holes in the rocks. They would listen and they would interpret it. The same thing that the oracle of Delphi is interpreted. It's speaking in an utterance that doesn't make sense. It's interpreted. The same thing at Dodona. The leaves of the oak tree rustle and the priests listen to the rustling and interpret. These are strong traditions of glossolalia at Corinth, surrounded by glossolalia. So that's why Paul is talking about tongues of men or of angels. These references are very, very easy to see if you know Greek archaeology. So whether it's the oracle of Delphi, Levadia, Trophonius, or Dodona, oracles and tongues are common things. Now there's Asclepius, the god of medicine. He's the son of Apollo, and there he is with his snake on the stick, which of course, as you know today, is a symbol of the AMA, the snake on the stick. And there is the incubaton where people come to sleep. This is the world's first psychiatric institution. Iatros is the Greek word for doctor. Medicus is Latin. Psyche is the word for soul. This was the center of psychiatry in the ancient world. Trust me on this one, or read it if you want. There's so many stories about Asclepius. People would come down, they would lay down in the chambers on these beds in the incubaton. They would dream, and the god would come to the dream and say, "What do you want?" And you would tell what you wanted, and then priests would interpret the next day what your dream was about, the presence of the god in the dream. There are a lot of books about this, about what's called oniroscopy in Greek, dream interpretation. Remember what Freud said. Well, I come from a long line of Jewish dream interpreters. You know, there's Joseph, and there's Daniel, and there's me, Sigmund. Anyway, but what you do, you dream, and the priest would interpret your dream. The famous story is of a lady who was barren, and that was a curse in the ancient world. So she said, I really want to become pregnant. She laid down, and the God came in her dream, and her husband didn't respect her because she never got pregnant. And so she laid down, and the God said, what do you want? She said, I just want to be pregnant. He said, is that all you want, just to be pregnant? And then she woke up, suddenly something happened, and she didn't get to finish her dream. So she told the priest her dream the next morning. They said, okay, well, the God's going to come through for you. She went home, and a letter came back later on, I'm pregnant. And this went on, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 15 months. They finally brought her back in a wagon groaning to this huge lady needing to be, relieved of this burden. And the priest said, oh, please come in. I'm not sure you can sleep easily, lady. How do you sleep at night? She said, I'm not sleeping well. They said, obviously. So she went to sleep. They gave her some potions to sleep. And in the dream, Asclepius came and said, see, I told you so. You should have asked for something more. What do you want? She said, deliver me. And so she named the baby Asclepius in honor of the god. That literally is a story, of course, but this is the sort of thing that happened in the sanctuary of Asclepius, which is where all good doctors were trained, in the Asclepia. Apparently, Luke was trained in the Asclepian tradition as a doctor. That's what tradition says. Now, there are some medical instruments of a iatros or medicus. Iatros Greek, medicus Latin. Those are doctor's tools at Epidaurus. So, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop. Can I show you one picture real quick? Okay, when you go to Pergamon, we're not going to get there. Smyrna, the temple of Nemesis, you can see Nemesis there. You don't want bad luck. But when you go to Pergamon, here's Laodicea with its hot springs, sulfur hot springs that had an eye salve that really helped eye salve for those of you ophthalmologists in the room. Now, there was the water that came from hot springs, but by the time it got to Laodicea and Colossae, it was lukewarm. So if you want to read that. But here at Pergamon was the great, notice, here's Pergamon where Satan lives. Now, why would John say that? Well, there's the great altar of Zeus. That was said to be Satan's seat. It was a throne, but it really wasn't. That's an altar where hundreds of bulls were sacrificed. But they called this Satan's seat. The early Christians did. All right, I'm sorry we have to stop. But there's so much more that could be said. And thank you for your patience in going through with me some of this material. Because, remember, you don't prove the Bible true. That's a huge conundrum. But there's a lot of archaeology that can help to illuminate the context. Thank you so much.